Chapter 3 1st of March, Kharkiv. Ksenia finished talking to her mother on the phone, who had been checking up on her every day since the invasion began. The past 2 days she spent at the hospital, although she miraculously was unscathed after one of the invader vehicles opened fire on her and her friends. Her friend Olesia, on the other hand, was being treated and had to get plenty of rest. Ksenia was staying by her friend's side during these 2 days. She couldn't leave Olesia by herself without a friendly face close by, and she was also increasingly scared to go back to the apartment to be on her own. It was best to stay together with her friend. Sleeping wasn't easy in a hospital with a lack of space and constant noise, but these were the least of her concerns. Mentally, she was still shaken after what happened, especially witnessing the sight of Anton getting killed in such a violent way. She kept having nightmares for the past 2 nights. In a nightmare, she was seeing herself and Olesia driving in a car, only for a spray of bullets to come out of nowhere and hit them both. Each time she found herself waking up in cold sweat and a racing heartbeat. After putting her phone in one of her jacket pockets and taking a deep breath in, she headed back to the ward where Olesia was. She usually stayed close to it and hadn't even left the same floor for the past 2 days. Olesia was peacefully sleeping when Ksenia entered the room, so she decided not to disturb her friend and simply sat down on a chair nearest the bed where her friend lay. Her gaze diverted to the screen of a TV in the room. News were showing the most recent Russian attack on their country, a missile hitting the Freedom Square in Kharkiv city center. Seeing the clips of destruction from that missile were making Ksenia really sorrowful and wanting to cry. Why are they trying to wipe us out? Why did we deserve this? These were some of the questions she kept asking herself. Thankfully, the invaders were quickly pushed out of the city over the past day, but they were still attempting to surround it and kept continuously shelling, and this made life in Kharkiv exceedingly dangerous. "Hey, how are you, Ksenia?" Olesia's voice came. Ksenia turned over her shoulder and saw that Olesia was already awake. "I'm okay, dear. How are you feeling?" Ksenia diverted the question back as she felt Olesia's condition was much more important to discuss. "I'm recovering. Just the shoulder feels a bit, I don't know, hard to move." "Just give it time and don't strain it. I'm sure once it's fully healed, you'll be able to move with it freely again." "Yeah," Olesia agreed and went silent. "Have you also been having nightmares these past 2 nights?" Ksenia changed the topic. "Last night I did, yeah. Saw us 3 trying to run down a road whilst the invaders shot at us. A bit similar to what I've been seeing too. I miss Anton. I can't believe he's gone." Olesia began crying. "It was all my fault. I should have listened to you that it was too dangerous to try and leave the city." "No, don't say that. None of us could have known what could happen in the city. We were all trying to do what was best. We were all trying to stay alive." "You're right. It's those barbaric occupiers that we need to blame. The damned orcs they are. The fascists took my brother from me and brought so much violence and despair to our peaceful country. They all deserve to be in hell." Ksenia could feel her friend's anger and despair. She felt the same emotions and wished she could do something to change the situation. But she could also understand that she alone could not do much, and this was making her feel hopeless and defenseless. She realized that within just a few days, her life was no longer in her control and was fully dependent on the larger circumstances in the entire country. "By the way," she suddenly remembered, "the hospital mentioned that they got in contact with your dad and that he will be coming here." Olesia nodded to show that she understood and then gazed at the TV screen to see the devastation that was being shown on the news. "Want me to get you something to eat?" Ksenia said as she got off the chair. "I don't have much hunger, but I won't object. Need to make myself eat if I want to recover soon." "All right, I'll be right back then." "Thanks, Ksenia. I appreciate you being here for me." Ksenia smiled feebly and then walked over to the door and left the room to try and get them both something to eat. 1st of March, Kiev. Oleksiy was at Dmitro's house. Dmitro's wife Lilia cooked some traditional Ukrainian meals with the ingredients they had at home. Food choices were limited in Kiev these days, but Lilia did her best with what was at home. Lilia was always very homely and enjoyed the simple things that created a cozy atmosphere for those around her. The last few days had been hard and depressing in Kiev, and air raid alarms kept coming on and off throughout the entire time, even during the nights. So a little bit of positive time with dear people was essential for staying strong and motivated. "Is Vadim coming as well?" Alexei asked his friend. "Yes, he said he would, although he sounded off," Dmitro answered. "I could hear sadness in his voice, but he didn't tell me anything. This war has affected all of us, so he must be going through a very hard time too." Lilia brought some more food at this point, set it on the table, and then sat down. "Eat as much as you like, Alexei. Don't be shy," she said. "Thank you. Hope you're feeling better after the fighting on our city's doorstep. Dmitry told me it was pretty fierce." "Yeah, it was a huge relief that the city held on. I can't really say that I contributed much though. I've not fired a single shot," Alexei explained modestly. "Neither have I," Dmitry admitted. "But we've all stood together and beaten the enemy back, and that's what counts, brother." "I agree with you 100%, Alexei said as he put a few vareniki on his plate. "I'm sure all of us will be ready to spend the whole night defending the city again should the need arise." All three of them got lost in thoughts here, reflecting on the events of the last few days and still trying to accept it as their new reality. A part of Alexei still felt as though it was all just a bad dream, a dream he couldn't wake up from. He was still trying to cope with the fact that the horrors of war had come back to haunt him after 8 years, and at this time it was a lot worse, and a lot more was at stake. "I'm going to be helping to set up the defenses in the city," Alexei stated after the silence. "Every single one of us counts. I think only through mutual effort we'll be able to beat back the occupiers." "I'm going to be right there with you," Dmitry acknowledged. "No orc will dare set foot in Kiev, not on my watch." A second later, there was a knock on their apartment door. "This must be Vadim," Lilia said and got up to open the door. Their apartment was rather modest in size and the front door was just within a few steps from the dining room. Lilia opened the door, and as they expected, it was Vadim, Alexei's and Dmitro's boss at the car garage shop. Vadim was in his late 40s, but at this moment he looked like he was a good 10 years older. Grief and anxiety were all over his face. "Vadim, what happened?" Lilia asked before he even stepped in. He went inside, took his hat off and briefly closed his eyes so he could muster up the strength to speak. "My children in Kharkiv came under fire from a Russian military vehicle. My son Anton died, and my daughter Olesia is now in a hospital." Tears rolled down his face after saying that. It looked like the news hit him really hard, as they would hit any person who loses a child. He sat down by the table next to Dmitro, looking downwards the entire time and struggling to stay strong. Alexei and Dmitro saw Vadim more as a good friend than a boss, and it was normal for them to share personal problems with each other. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to bring in more problems. We were supposed to be having an enjoyable evening together," he apologized. "Hey, we understand that. It is best that you are here with us at this horrendous time," Alexei responded. "Yeah, horrendous indeed. I should have been there with them." "It's not your fault," Lilia tried to console him. Alexei couldn't imagine in how much mental pain Vadim was at this moment. He remembered the time when he lost his father and how hard it hit him and his whole family, how much they cried and how empty their lives felt. But to lose children must have been even harder and much more difficult to bear. "Listen, Dmitro, Alexei, I'll be leaving to Kharkiv tomorrow morning to be with my daughter," Vadim declared. "I'd like to leave you two in charge of our car garage in my absence. Once it gets safe enough to reopen it, feel free to do so. And if the army requires any tools or spare parts to help in the city's defenses, you give them anything they need. Do anything that will help to kill as many of those bastards that have attacked us and came to kill our children." Alexei and Dmitro both agreed and showed their understanding. Keeping the city safe was the priority at that moment, because their business wouldn't be able to function properly until the safety of the citizens was re-established and some form of peace was back in the country. "Will you be okay driving on your own?" Dmitro asked after a few moments. "Your blood pressure must be in a danger zone after today's news." "I have no choice but to be okay," Vadim replied. "For my daughter's sake, I have to get there by any means and to support her." Alexei admired Vadim's persistence in the face of so many problems and danger. He reminded him of his own father, who also never gave up, no matter how hard something was. Alexei intended to be the same way. He had good role models in his life, and he wanted to follow their example, to prove to himself that he was strong and could endure no matter what the world threw at him. 2nd of March, Kherson. Over the last few days, the fighting in Kherson moved further inward into the city. Taras continued to help the military in an attempt to impede enemy progress. He did not know how much longer they would be able to hold the invaders off, but he intended to take out as many of them as possible, even if they took the city eventually. He wished for some backup to come and help, but he realized that other cities were also struggling and there was simply not enough soldiers to stop this gargantuan enemy force. He and several other soldiers were taking cover behind buildings and barricades along one of the city's streets on the outskirts of the city. Russian forces were at the other end of the street. Taras could see several tanks approaching and braced himself for another fierce confrontation with the attackers. "Get those Enlos and javelins here," one of the soldiers shouted, trying to get someone to bring the anti-tank weapons forward. A few soldiers ran in, carrying what was requested. There weren't enough anti-tank weapons for all the tanks that were getting nearer. It looked to Taras that they might be needing to retreat again. Their forces were spread out too thinly, and the enemy appeared to be having an infinite number of troops to throw at them. The enemy tanks were even closer now. A couple of them fired at the barricades, causing massive and deafening explosions at the places where their shells landed. The soldiers that had anti-tank weapons now stepped forward and were preparing to fire them at the tanks when the unit commander came and yelled to stop. What? Why should we stop? Taras was confused for a moment when he heard the command. "Orders from the top," the commander spoke once everyone ceased shooting and things got quieter. "The city has been surrounded by the enemy, and we are to lay down our arms and surrender." "No way!" Taras yelled out loud, unable to stop himself. "We have no choice. These are our orders and we will obey them," the commander responded to Taras's outburst. Taras turned back to face the enemy forces. Some of the infantry now appeared in sight too, emerging from behind the tanks. The enemy really was too numerous. The choice became quite clear. Either they surrendered or they got slaughtered by the enemy forces. A few of the Ukrainian defenders began to lay down their arms. Taras was reluctant to do the same, as he really wanted to kill as many of the invaders as possible. But now was not the best time, and it was better to surrender. So he did. The next few minutes were tense and full of despondency as the Russian soldiers surrounded them from all sides and had them discard all weapons, ammo and grenades they had with them. The enemy had them and the whole city captive, and Taras knew that there was nothing more he could do about it other than simply accept the outcome. Kherson was lost. 2nd of March, Mykolaiv. Solomia was back to working in a hospital. She was given the last 2 days off to mourn the death of her beloved, and today she was expected to come back to work. To her, 2 days were nowhere near enough to pick herself up after losing Timur. Her mental suffering only got worse because she was all alone these days and for the first time felt the lack of her beloved nearby, with the dreadful reality setting in that he was gone forever. Now that she was at work, she tried to put on a brave face. She tied her long dark hair in a ponytail, made sure her uniform was clean and tidy, and reached the ward where she was told to work today. Some of the hospital corridors were full with people, waiting to be treated for their injuries or their pre-existing conditions. With the sharp influx of patients, the doctors and nurses were too overworked and couldn't manage to see everyone on time. Solomia stopped briefly in one of the empty corridors, closing her eyes and trying to stay strong. She felt that her whole mental state was being held together just with toothpicks and rubber bands, and would fall apart at any moment. During some moments the intensity of feelings would increase, and then after some time they would subside. During moments of heightened emotions, Solomia felt crippled and unable to do anything. She simply had to stop doing everything, close her eyes, and fight with her inner self. "Solomia, how are you feeling, dear? I've heard what happened to Timur. I'm so sorry." A familiar voice came from behind her. Solomia turned around and saw her friend Nadia, who was also working at this hospital as a nurse. Nadia was only slightly older, and the two of them had many common interests and often talked to each other whenever they had breaks from work. Upon seeing Nadia, Solomia felt a little easier. It was pleasant to see a friendly face. "I'm managing," Solomia gave a brief response whilst wiping away a tear that was rolling down her cheek. "If you ever need to get anything off your mind, I'm always here to listen," Nadia tried to comfort her. "Thank you, Nadia. You're a wonderful friend. I hope everything is fine with your family." "More or less, yes. Although I'll likely be going to Kropivnitsky in a few days where they live. They need help and support. Kropivnitsky was a city a few hours north of Mykolaiv, closer to the central parts of Ukraine. Solomia realized her friend would be somewhat far away, and they probably wouldn't see each other for a while. "Are you going to stay there long?" Solomia was curious, as she hoped for her friend to not be gone for a long time. "Honestly, don't know. It depends on how much help my parents need. I'll likely be working there for the time being. But I hope to come back here soon. All of my friends are here. I'll miss you greatly, but I understand. Your family really needs you, and you should be with them at a difficult time like this." "Thanks, Solomia. Let's stay in contact whilst I'm away. At a time like this, we all need to stick together." "I'd like that very much. You know, I've been in my thoughts a lot these days, and I realized something very important," Solomia stated with a hint of contemplative expression on her face. "There's a separate battle within each of us. For some of us who lost their loved ones in this war, this battle is harder, but the outcome is all the same. We can only achieve victory if we manage to rise over the darkness in us. And to do that alone, without support of loved ones, is just incredibly hard. I agree with you completely. We'll pull through this together. Ukraine will pull through this." On that note, Nadia continued with her work duties and Solomia began hers. Solomia knew it was going to be a very tough shift to get through on an emotional level, and that there would be many moments of weakness. Her mind would not be fully focused on her work most of the time, but she was prepared to fight through all the pain and do whatever she could to move forward one day at a time. Today will be very hard, but tomorrow will be a little bit better, and day after, even better than that. She knew she merely needed to stay strong until time healed the gaping wound in her heart. She didn't know how long it would take. Perhaps it wouldn't fully heal at all, but it had to get better than now. It had to. 3rd of March, Mariupol. The last 24 hours were some of the worst. Daniil and Lera could hear a lot of shelling going on above. It seemed like the shelling was unending for many hours straight. The thoughts of seeing the city after all of that were frightening Daniil, so he kept trying to push them away. Now that the shelling had stopped and it had been quiet for a couple of hours, several people in the same shelter decided to go up above and to restock on supplies, as the food and water were running low inside the shelter. "We should go as well. We've been boxed in here all week," Daniil suggested to his sister. "Just give me a moment. I need to clear my thoughts. I'm really worried about Mom and Dad," Lera said whilst looking down at the floor. The last message Daniil received on his phone was over a day ago, and it was an update that their parents had gone missing. After that, the batteries in both of their phones had died, and they were unable to recharge them. There was no electricity in the shelter all these days, and the portable generator to provide electricity during the blackouts was depleted by now, with everyone needing to use it. "I know, sis. I worry for them too. I just hope and pray to God that they're still alive. And now we'll never know, because we'll not be able to charge our phones. They will probably inform us some other way." Daniil tried to be a little hopeful and to encourage his sister. He had to try to keep her motivated and not give up, as he hated seeing her depressed. "Alright, let's just go outside and get some more food. The enemies will likely continue shelling us again soon, and I'd rather be back here when that happens." Lera got up from the chair and joined her brother. They gently walked up the stairs and past a couple of doors till they were outside. It was late morning time by the looks of it. The residential buildings in front of them, that stood opposite to the shelter entrance, were in a terrible shape. There were enormous pitch-black char marks all over them, holes and chunks missing in some of the walls, and huge heaps of rocky debris laying at their feet. And there was smoke and soot in every inch of the air. It all looked as though a tsunami of fire had passed through the area and left its hideous scorch marks on the buildings. They briskly walked past the first few buildings on the way to their own apartment block. It too was in a similar shape as the buildings they had just seen. Some of the walls that they passed were full of small holes, indicating that they were peppered with shrapnel when the bombing was happening. A shudder overtook Daniil when seeing shrapnel marks in the buildings, as he immediately imagined the sensation of getting hit by shrapnel, flying at deadly speeds and wedging in flesh and bone. "Daniil, look!" Lera pointed a few floors up. She was pointing at where their apartment was. Daniil's eyes widened as he now saw a horrendously big hole in the building instead of the familiar balcony that used to be there. "Our apartment," Daniil barely spoke out, feeling like he was about to throw up. Lera began crying her eyes out after seeing the state of the building, realizing that their apartment was no more, Daniel put both of his arms around her to try and console her, even though he was feeling just as weak and wished someone would console him instead. What sort of monsters would do this? It was so hard to accept that just a few days ago this whole neighborhood was whole and intact and peaceful, and now it was charred and in ruins. Now it became unlivable in a matter of just a few days. "We need to go up there and see what survived," he then suggested. "Maybe we can grab a few more of our belongings." Lara agreed without saying anything, and the two of them went into the building and headed up the stairs. There were numerous stones and pieces of broken walls scattered all over the stairs, so they had to be careful as they were ascending. The dust that filled the air inside the building was irritating to the eyes and throat. Daniel found himself needing to cough a few times in order to clear his throat. Once they reached their front door, Daniel unlocked it and pushed it open. He could see that Lara was turning away and was apprehensive to be greeted with the sight of destruction. As the door swung open, Daniel peered inside. He could barely recognize their apartment. It looked completely different to what it was like just a few days ago. Lara followed him inside and mustered up the courage to see what happened. Her eyes were wide open in shock and tears were coming down from them. Half of the kitchen was gone, as was half of the living room. One of the bedrooms was gone completely. It was the bedroom where their parents had slept. Daniel couldn't help but notice the parallel between their parents being missing and the bedroom where their parents had slept also being gone. It felt like the universe was trying to tell him something, to send him the news that their parents would never return. He refused to believe it, but seeing his parents' belongings swept away into oblivion was not making it any easier to deny a bitter possibility. Both of them walked a bit further along their destroyed apartment, being careful with each step in case the floor was unstable. To their surprise, their bedroom was still fully intact, likely because it was further inside the building. However, standing in the center of the living room, Daniel could see the remains of the apartment above them through a massive hole in the ceiling, as well as the remains of the apartment below, as half of the floor was missing. And in front, when looking outside through the empty space where walls used to be, and seeing more neighborhoods, all that Daniel and Lara could see were signs of relentless aggression and destruction. Entire neighborhoods were in ruins, each building more charred than the one before it, and patches of unsightly smoke everywhere. Next to the buildings were broken cars that now were nothing more than scrap metal, as well as toppled lampposts and trees, scattered all over the roads and sidewalks. It looked like a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie, and yet it was a reality which Daniel and Lara were now living. "Daniel, they've destroyed our city and our lives. They've destroyed everything," Lara cried with trembling words. Daniel gave his sister a hug to try and calm her. He knew that nothing he'd do would change what their city turned into, but he wanted to give some sense of comfort to his sister and make her feel a little safer. After a few moments of crying, Lara continued, "They are not our brothers. They are monsters. Brotherly nations do not do this to each other. Only savages do. I hope they all die. I hope they all burn in hell for eternity." Daniel didn't know what to think of all this, but Lara's words rang true. He couldn't imagine that reasonable and compassionate human beings would rain so much destruction on innocent civilians who posed no threat to anyone. "Let's take as much as we can," he suggested after a couple of more minutes of contemplation. "We may not return here again, so best to take anything that's useful." "Okay, and then what?" "Then we'll go and get some food and return to the shelter. There have been talks that civilian evacuations may happen soon in the days to come. I think it will be best for us to escape the city when the opportunity comes. It's not safe here at all." Lara didn't say anything and instead just went into their bedroom to look for anything useful such as clothes, shoes, blankets, and so on. Daniel took one more glimpse at the sight in front of him of the devastated neighborhood outside, then sighed and went to help his sister.